We have been discussing about Heraclitus' arche on fire. We continue further to discuss Heraclitus' yet other theory, which is the theory of opposites. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, Heraclitus, who is Heraclitus? Heraclitus of Ephesus is a pre-Socratic philosopher, often referred to as the obscure or the weeping philosopher, who is best known for his doctrine of flux and the unity of opposites. This theory constitutes one of the earliest and most profound metaphysical insights in Western philosophy. At its core, Heraclitus' concept of the unity of opposite posits that reality is constituted by the tension and interplay of contraries, and that these opposites are not merely coexistent but interdependent, forming a coherent and dynamic whole. Now, if we talk about the textual foundations and the core fragments of these principles of the theory of opposites, we find that the principal evidence for Heraclitus' philosophy comes from approximately 125 surviving fragments, preserved mostly through quotations by later thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and the Church Fathers. Among the most cited fragments related to the theory or the unity of opposites are fragment B10 that quotes, "Things taken together are whole and not whole, being brought together and brought apart, in tune and out of tune. Out of all things there comes a unity, and out of a unity all things." Yet again, in fragment B51, the other quotation, which is, "They do not understand how that which differs from itself is in agreement with itself, a back-turning harmony like that of the bow and the lyre." Fragment B88 quotes, "The same thing is both living and dead, walking and sleeping, young and old. The former turns into the latter, and the latter turns into the former." These aphorisms are not mere rhetorical paradoxes. They encode a profound ontological insight. Opposites are not separate realities, but facets of a singular, unified process of becoming. So, what is the ontological significance of the theory of opposites or the theory of unity? It is a dynamic unity. The Heraclitean cosmos is not a static assemblage of objects, but a dynamic process of transformation. His often quoted dictum, which is "everything flows," underscores this constant flux. The unity of opposites is therefore a fundamental feature of being itself. Reality exists through the tension and the interdependence of contraries, much like the tension in a bow or a lyre string gives rise to harmony. For Heraclitus, opposition is not a sign of disunity, but a necessary condition for the existence of order. War is called the father of all things, fragment B53, because it is through conflict and differentiation that all things emerge and sustain themselves. Thus, identity is constituted by difference. One cannot understand or experience life without death, good without evil, rest without motion. This dialectical interplay is what constitutes the fabric of the real. Heraclitus' vision radically redefines the nature of being and knowledge. Now, unlike Parmenides, who posits a static, unchanging reality, Heraclitus affirms that the world is in perpetual flux, pantharei. Change is not accidental, but essential to the very structure of reality. Opposites are not signs of contradiction, but of continuity and transformation. This has important epistemological consequences. Conventional human understanding, which tends to separate and categorize phenomena into binaries, fails to grasp the deeper truth of interdependence. Heraclitus suggests that wisdom lies in perceiving unity beneath apparent diversity and order with seeming contradiction. The logos is the principle that integrates these opposites into a coherent whole, even if it remains hidden from ordinary perception. Now, Heraclitus' unity of opposites or theory of opposites extends to his cosmology and ethical thought. The world is governed by logos, a rational principle or order that harmonizes opposites within a coherent whole. While humans often perceive contradiction, Heraclitus argues that this is due to their limited perspective. The logos ensures that the cosmos remains intelligible despite, or rather because of, its ever-changing, conflict-ridden nature. Ethically, this view encourages an attitude of acceptance towards change and adversity. Just as health arises from the balance of elements in the body, so does justice arise from the balance of competing forces in society. Heraclitus suggests that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the harmonious tension between opposite forces. Now, Heraclitus' notion of the unity of opposites foreshadows several key developments in later philosophy, be it with Plato and Plato's dialectical method, though critical of Heraclitus's epistemology, inherits the idea that truth emerges through the tension of opposites. Hegel explicitly acknowledges Heraclitus as a precursor to his own dialectics, famously stating that there is no proposition of Heraclitus which I have not adopted in my logic. Also, we see that in the comparisons, if we are to compare and see the legacy in the Eastern philosophies, the Taoists' concept of yin and yang, which posits that opposites are interdependent and cyclical, bears a striking resemblance to Heraclitus' vision. In modern physics, in quantum mechanics and relativity, entities often exhibit wave-particle duality or exist in superposed states, echoing the idea that identity emerges through duality and relational tension. Despite the profound insights, Heraclitus' theory has not been without critique. Parmenides, his near contemporary, rejected the idea of change altogether, arguing that being must be one and unchanging, and that change is illusory. Plato admired Heraclitus' poetic depth, but criticized his epistemological relativism. Nonetheless, modern philosophy has revalidated many of Heraclitus' intuitions. Phenomenologists and existentialists have embraced the concept of becoming, while process philosophers such as Whitehead have emphasized that reality is fundamentally relational and dynamic. Heraclitus of Ephesus thus presents one of the earliest and the most profound philosophical insights into the nature of reality, which is opposites are not genuinely contradictory but mutually dependent. This idea lies at the heart of his metaphysical framework and is pivotal to understanding his doctrine of logos, the rational principle governing the cosmos. Now, what is this interdependence of opposites then? Heraclitus asserts that opposites such as life and death, waking and sleeping, war and peace are not static binaries but exist in a dynamic and relational structure. He does not see these as mutually exclusive states but as phases in a process of becoming. They transform into one another, each necessitating the other to be meaningfully understood. The quote Fragment B88. The same thing is both living and dead, waking and sleeping, young and old. The former turns into the latter, and the latter turns into the former. This aphorism illustrates a dialectical vision of reality. That is, life contains the seed of death and vice versa. Each state or phenomenon gains meaning only in relation to its opposite. Peace would be inconceivable without the experience of conflict. Health becomes comprehensible only against the background of disease. In this sense, opposites are ontologically entangled, which is they not only do they coexist, but they also define, sustain and presuppose one another. Heraclitus exemplifies this interdependence with the analogy of the lyre and the bow, both of which rely on opposite tensions to function. Quote, Fragment B51. They do not understand how that which differs from itself is in agreement with itself, a back-turning harmony like that of the bow and the lyre. The bow only functions because the string is stretched between two opposing ends. Similarly, harmony or harmonia is not the absence of tension, but the resolution of it within a dynamic system. While Heraclitus' insight is deeply profound, it also invites several critical reflections. Linguistic ambiguity and paradox, for instance. Heraclitus' fragments are notoriously aphoristic and cryptic. His poetic style has led to multiple interpretations and even misinterpretations. The claim that something is both living and dead, or both in harmony and conflict, can border on incoherence if not carefully understood as describing processual states rather than static contradictions. Ambiguity in the nature of identity. Heraclitus' theory challenges the classical law of non-contradiction, a foundational principle in logic which states that a thing cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same respect. If something is living and dead, does this undermine rational consistency? Heraclitus might reply that things are not simultaneously alive and dead in the same aspect, but are in a continuous process of becoming, which sidesteps the contradiction. Nonetheless, his critics like Plato found this destabilizing. Comparative ontologies. Heraclitus incites a closure to process ontologies found in Eastern philosophies like yin and yang in Taoism and later in Whitehead's process metaphysics. Yet his formulation lacks a clear systematic structure, making it difficult to distinguish ontological necessity from phenomenological observation. For example, the question that arises now is, do opposites have to exist for each other, or do they merely appear so from a human perspective? Now, there's also an ethical ambiguity here. If all opposites are interdependent, does these blur moral distinctions? Can good only be defined through evil? Is justice unintelligible without injustice? Heraclitus does not offer a moral relativism, but his metaphysics raises questions about whether ethical opposites are also part of the same cosmic balance. Later, Stoics adopted his ideas but were more careful to preserve ethical norms. Now let's see the relevance to contemporary thought, the theory of opposites. Modern science and philosophy have in some ways vindicated Heraclitus. Quantum mechanics reveals entities that exhibit wave-particle duality, being both A and not A, depending on perspective. Dialectical reasoning, especially in Hegel and Marx, builds on the Heraclitean insight that development occurs through the synthesis of opposites. Post-structuralist thought in philosophy, example Derrida's difference, also echoes the idea that identity is constructed through difference. Yet, these developments also highlight the challenge Heraclitus poses to foundationalism, logical positivism, and analytic clarity. His vision resists reduction and invites a more holistic and integrative epistemology, one that appreciates the dynamic and interrelated nature of reality. So we see that Heraclitus' statement that opposites are not truly opposed but interdependent encapsulates one of the earliest formulations of a dialectical worldview. In affirming that all things exist through a unity of opposites, Heraclitus offers a vision of reality as tensional, dynamic, and coherent. While this insight has been both celebrated and bemoaned for its ambiguity, it remains a cornerstone of metaphysical thought, reminding us that understanding often lies not in separating contraries, but in seeing how they sustain and define each other within the cosmic order. So Heraclitus's theory of unity of opposites is a landmark in the history of metaphysical thought. It challenges rigid dualisms and affirms a vision of reality in which opposites are bound together in mutual dependence. Far from being more contraries, opposites are essential dimensions of a unified and evolving whole. In an age increasingly attuned to complexity, polarity, and systematic interrelation, Heraclitus' insight into the unity of opposites remain not only relevant but vital. So central to this doctrine is his profound insight that change arises not from the elimination of opposites but through their dynamic tension and ultimate reconciliation. This concept is one of the earliest formulations of what would later influence dialectical thinking in Western philosophy. Thus, quickly, number one is change as a dynamic process. Heraclitus is famously associated with the idea that everything flows. Although he never wrote this phrase verbatim, the spirit of this idea is captured in fragment B12, where he says, "Upon those who step into the same river, different and again different waters flow." Here Heraclitus illustrates that nothing is static. Everything is in a state of flux, including the observer. The river remains the same only in name or form. Its reality consists of continuous movement and change. This change, however, is not chaotic but structured through oppositional forces. Secondly, tension between opposites as the engine of change. For Heraclitus, the world is not governed by pure harmony or pure conflict, but by dialectical unity, a structured tension of opposites. He illustrates this with a metaphor of the boar and the lair. So these instruments produce harmony because of their opposing tensions. And in fragment B3, where he says, "War is the father of all and king of all," some it makes gods, others men, some of it makes slaves, others free. So here, war here symbolizes the conflict inherent in change, not violent destruction but productive tension. From this conflict arises order, differentiation, identity, and transformation. Reconciliation, which is not elimination but integration. So the theory of unity of opposites, here Heraclitus does not argue that change happens by resolving opposites in favor of one or the other. Not at all. Like, good conquering evil. No. He says instead that true reconciliation lies in the recognition that opposites are two sides of the same process. This means change is not the negation of difference, but it is creative unfolding. Heraclitus' insight can be viewed as a cosmic balancing act, a dynamic unity in which difference and oppositions are essential. This reflects a metaphysical optimism. The universe is intelligible, structured by a logos, which ensures that opposites are integrated into a coherent whole. The philosophical significance, as reiterated, we know that this insight is significant for several reasons, like for the emergence of dialectical method, phenomenology of life, natural philosophy. When we talk further, we see that while Heraclitus' vision of change is compelling, it is also philosophically demanding. His language is famously enigmatic, and later thinkers like Parmenides challenged the reliance on change, arguing instead for a static, unchanging reality. Moreover, some critics point out that the ethical ambiguity in accepting conflict and tension as inherent to reality. If war and strife are necessary to change, does this justify them morally? Heraclitus himself does not provide a systematic ethical framework, leaving that question open to interpretation. So we see that Heraclitus' claim that change involves the tension and reconciliation of opposites captures a deep ontological truth. The world is not a place of stable identities, but of constant becoming. This becoming is driven by tensions, but these tensions are not destructive, they are creative and generative. Change in Heraclitus' cosmos is not disorder, but a hidden harmony, the unfolding of reality through the dynamic interplay of opposites. So we see that the intellectual lineage of that connects Heraclitus, say, to Hegel vis-a-vis the dialectical thinking spans more than 2 millennia, yet at its core lies a shared conviction that is, reality is dynamic, self-contradictory and developmental. Heraclitus did not invent dialectics in the systematic form Hegel did, but his insight that opposites are interdependent and change arises through their tension laid the foundational groundwork for what would later mature into a full-fledged dialectical philosophy. Also, we must remember that Hegel openly acknowledges Heraclitus as an intellectual predecessor, famously writing, quote, "There is no proposition of Heraclitus which I have not adopted in my logic," in his Science of Logic in the preface. So Hegel also regarded contradiction not as a flaw in thinking, but as the engine of reality itself, just as Heraclitus did. Thus, both thinkers, Heraclitus and Hegel, reject static metaphysics, which Parmenides or traditional essentialism does hold on to, and embraces a vision of the real as internally divided and self-overcoming. For Heraclitus, fire symbolized the ever-living change. For Hegel, spirit evolved through stages of alienation and reconciliation. Now, Heraclitus' contribution was also a primarily ontological, about being and becoming. Hegel extends this into the realms of epistemology and historical development. In phenomenology of spirit, the self or consciousness comes to know itself through encountering opposition and contradiction, the master-slave dialectic. In logic, he shows that pure concepts, being, nothing, becoming, necessarily develop into more complex structures via contradiction and mediation. We also see that Heraclitus laid the metaphysical foundation, where the world is just not a static substance, but a dynamic interplay of opposites. So while the continuity between Heraclitus and Hegel is substantial, several differences remain, such as scope and structure, which is Heraclitus remains fragmentary and poetic. Hegel builds an elaborate and rigorous system. Teleology, Heraclitus does not explicitly propose a goal or end of becoming. Hegel sees history and spirit as having a rational telos, the realization of freedom. Heraclitus' logos is cosmic and impersonal. Hegel's spirit is more historically embedded and often interpreted in quasi-theological terms. Nevertheless, Heraclitus' vision of unity through conflict is the earliest philosophical anticipation of dialectical development, and without it, the evolution of dialectical thought from Plato and the Stoics to Marx and beyond would be incomplete. Thus, Heraclitus' insight that reality unfolds through the tension and reconciliation of opposites deeply influenced the trajectory of Western metaphysics and laid the ontological groundwork for later dialectical systems. Hegel inherited this insight and transformed it into a comprehensive philosophical method, seeing contradiction not as a limitation but as the very source of development in thought, nature, and history. In this profound philosophical lineage, Heraclitus is the dialectician of nature and Hegel the dialectician of history and space. So with this, if some of you are further interested for original texts and translations, one can definitely go through Professor Kirk, Revin and Schofield's work on Heraclitus, which was published by Cambridge University Press. There is also Professor Philip Wheelwright's work published in 1959 about Heraclitus, the Cosmic Fragments by Princeton University Press. There is also T.M. Robinson's 1987 published work, Heraclitus, Fragments by University of Toronto Press. And if people are interested in Hegel, of course, Hegel's Science of Logic, Humanity Books 1969, and Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. So the dialectical movement of consciousness and themes of negation and reconciliation are developed with Heraclitean undertones. And with this, we do see how Heraclitus, with his theory of unity of opposites, have had the massive impact to a lot of philosophers, including Hegel. Thank you so much.